Next up, the reflex arc. So we're just going to take a look at a simple reflex here. Sensory input coming here from the sensory neuron, and then we're going to follow this here. The cell body here of that sensory neuron is localized right here, and we're going into the spinal cord in the dorsal horn right here, synapsing to an interneuron, and then output with a motor neuron back here to skeletal muscle. So that's a simple reflex arc. I've had students that found it helpful to remember it with the code word SIM for sensory input, S, sensory, and I for interneuron, and then here motor neuron output. So it spells SIM. Sorry, that looks almost like a 5, but it's supposed to be an S. Okay. In your book, you'll find this image, same. The stimulus is processed via sensory neuron into the spinal cord. Then we're synapsing to an interneuron, and out we go with the motor neuron, actually giving commands to muscles. That could also be glands. Then that gives us the response. Here we have a reviewed slide on the anatomy of the brain, and the medulla is also included. Just review this as needed. Hopefully you remember some of this from anatomy. Quick anatomy review of the brainstem. 11 out of 12 cranial nerves originate there. We have many nuclei that are associated with the reticular formation. Then, of course, the medulla region with the somatosensory and corticospinal tracts, and then pons and midbrain. This figure here shows you the anatomy summary of the brainstem, and then down here, this is where it gets more interesting, the function of the parts of the main brainstem. Just review this. Hopefully, again, you should remember some of this from anatomy. Now here, quick review of the cranial nerves. There are 12 of them, of course. You probably had to memorize all 12 of them for anatomy. For physiology, the ones that we will be mentioning in various lectures to come, for example, the sensory lecture, sensory physiology, of course, we need the olfactory, we need the optic nerve. Then we're going to skip down here to the vestibulocochlear nerve, formerly known as the auditory nerve. That's cranial nerve number 8. That one we need. And then we need, for physiology, of course, we need the vagus nerve. And we'll mention that one particularly in the autonomic nervous system lecture. So here, more anatomy review. Here, a lateral view of the central nervous system, of course, CNS composed of brain and spinal cord. Here, a lateral view of the brain with the main paired lobes. And then down here, the cerebellum, the pons region, the medulla region. And here, moving on to the diencephalon. Very important for physiology, of course, the hypothalamus region as sort of the center for your endocrine functions. And then together with the pituitary, these two are the bosses of your endocrine function. Let's take a look at some of the functions of the hypothalamus. You can read through that. I don't need to read that off to you. But the hypothalamus will be very, very important when we do the endocrine chapter, endocrine functions. And you can see the hypothalamus. This is where a lot of your drives and your homeostasis is localized, controlling a lot of your homeostasis. And here, a mid-sagittal view of the brain showing you the main lobes again. And then here, another representation here. This is where you're going to have some of the basal ganglia. They are sort of being pointed at here in this section of the brain. This slide here shows you the layers of the gray matter and where, in which part of these layers, various of these cell bodies are originating. This is not very important for us. I'm just going to move on from there. Let's take a look at the limbic system here. So that's basically various parts of the brain that work together to achieve your emotional state. So the limbic system roughly describes basically what's going on with your emotional states. And the parts that are contributing to your limbic system will be the thalamus region, very important. The hippocampus region, also very important. The amygdala, very important for the limbic system. And the cingulate gyrus right here, so of course important. And in here, simple and complex pathways in the brain. So a nice simple one over here on A. You have a sensory input integration. That means you did send these the information up to the brain. It got integrated, and then a lot of the sensory input goes to the hypothalamus region or thalamus region in general, and then the integration takes place and a response is formed. We're sending output, and then we get our result. A more complex kind of pathway would involve that you have sensory system reporting information. You may have a motor output right away, so that would be more of a reflex kind of situation. But once you send the information up to the central nervous system for evaluation, then you may have alterations in behavioral states. You may have cognitive system involved. Also, the physiological response or behavior will send feedback information. So let's say your hypothalamus decided to send out a certain hormone, and then the physiological response takes place, and you're sending feedback back to the hypothalamus to make sure that sort of the orders were being followed, and now everything is back in homeostasis. Okay, the cerebral cortex. So we're gonna, of course, I mean, this is a huge area. This would be worth a whole course, but oh well, for what it's worth. Let's just take it, divide it up into 3 areas or 3 specializations. The sensory area, then the motor area, and then association areas. So in the sensory area, that's where sensory input is received and then translated into a perception of some sort of some sensory, you have a sensory perception there. The motor areas, they are responsible for skeletal muscle movement, coordination, and then we have association areas. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. You have these slices of cortex that I want to point out. In the red here, this slice of cortex that is sort of highlighted here in red, that would be your primary motor cortex. And so there you're coordinating skeletal muscle movement. Now here, in blue, that slice of cortex is the primary somatic sensory cortex. Now, keep in mind that the special senses like vision, they have their own association area. So that will be visual processing ends up in the occipital lobe after passing through several other areas, of course. But your somatic senses like touch, perception, pressure reception, body position perception, hot and cold receptors, chemoreceptors that are all over the body, that would end up in the primary somatic sensory cortex for evaluation. Okay, so let's take a look at cerebral lateralization. This is sort of the traditional view of all of this. People have sort of associated certain perceptions or abilities with left brain versus right brain, with roughly the division that the left side of the brain is where you do your analysis, where you have perception of, so your speech center is right there, writing, language, math, basically all of the sort of the more analytical parts of the brain. And then and the right brain side, that's more your visual spatial kind of analysis. That's more the artistic side of you. So there are different other models out there for whatever it's worth. This is sort of the traditional view of the cerebral lateralization. Now let's go back to take a look at the processing of sensory information. We do have for the somatic senses, that means these body-wide senses that you would see right here, touch, temperature, pain, itch, body position. So these are body-wide senses and therefore referred to as somatic senses. Remember, we have the slice of cortex that's reserved for that. So let's go back. That would be the primary somatic sensory cortex right here. This is that blue slice where the information ends up. So that blue slice is the termination point for pathways from the skin, musculoskeletal system, and the viscera, so your organs. And it's processing the information from these body-wide kind of receptors that are listed right here. Now, the special senses, they have their own evaluation areas in the brain. And so, of course, vision is a very complex kind of sensory input that needs to be evaluated for various other aspects, not just de facto what you see, but you also need to evaluate whether something is moving, whether it might be dangerous, whether it's something coming towards you or moving away from you, then the color of the object that you're looking at, or maybe while you're reading something, attach a meaning to all of this, or recognize a face. So that's very complex. And so therefore, the visual cortex is sort of a specialized area of the brain that evaluates all of the aspects associated with vision. Auditory cortex, also very complex. That's where you evaluate auditory information. We will see it's not just one area, it's several areas of the brain that then converge the information to give you sort of a well-rounded picture of what's going on, what you're hearing, or what you're seeing. The olfactory cortex and gustatory cortex, not quite as complex. Those are more simple evaluation areas, but nevertheless, they have their own devoted regions in the brain. Now let me say a word about perception in general. So when your brain receives a visual input from your retina, from the eyes, it's impossible to process every bit of information. So as you're learning to be in your environment and you're growing up and your childhood experiences, your brain is learning things. And what it will do is it will then, as you're looking at an object and receiving an onslaught of information, it will only process a very small percentage of that information and then make up the rest based on experience and learning. So you can tell, for example, the square that you perceive here is not really there. It's not outlined at all, but your brain just adds that information that you see a square right there. Or here, based on previous experience, your brain adds perspective into this object, but it can't really make sense of it because the perspective here is off. Or here, what you see here is that the lines are perceived as being not straight and not parallel either. So they seem to bulge out in the center right here and then get skinnier as we are going off to the sides. Now that's not true. You can prove it. You can put a ruler piece on there and you can demonstrate that these lines actually are straight and that they are completely parallel to one another. But your brain is making stuff up based on learning and based on past experiences of looking at something similar. So here also depth perception. We automatically perceive something that is farther away. It must be bigger. So these two balls, they have exactly the same size, but because this one is perceived as farther back, it is automatically your brain sort of makes you think that it must be bigger. So here, look at this triangle. That's impossible for your brain to figure out. Take a look at this elephant right here, and you would think, okay, this elephant, well, let's count how many legs does it have. Can't be that difficult. Well, let's start here with this one right here. So we think, oh, of course, this must be one of the legs, and then it goes into nothing. Well, is it a leg? How about we're starting here on the bottom? And we think, okay, this is a foot right here, so let's follow this. Is it a leg? I guess it could be. Or how about here? Let's take a look at this one in the front, and it goes into nothing. So you can just muse over this and spend some time on that, but it's just an example of how much your brain makes up. And we're just going to move into the motor system next, but that will be the next part of this lecture.